All right, good evening and welcome to this evening's event titled Muslims, Latter-day Saints, and Our Democratic Faith with special guests, Ambassador Jeff Flake and Salam Al-Marayati. I'm Jason Olson, the director here at the Tempe Institute of Religion, which is sponsored by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And here in this space, we have religion classes throughout the day and lots of social activities and dollar lunches for our students. One of the things when we were preparing for this event, Professor Carlson and I were walking through this space, and he asked me a question that I had not anticipated. He said, "What do you hope to get from this event?" And two words came immediately to my mind: relationships and understanding. And I hope that happens for all of us tonight. And so we're grateful to be here with these two speakers and representing these two great faith groups. I'm sure for many of you, this may be your first time in this building, so we want to just kind of orient you to a few things. They're just right outside these doors, all the way down to the end of the hall, are bathrooms, men and women bathrooms, and a drinking fountain. And we also recognize that for many of our friends of the Muslim faith who are here today, this is taking place during prayer. So right through those doors, we've designated the library space for you. So please feel free at any time to stand up and go to that space just right outside these doors to have your prayers. Next, if we could remind everybody to silence your phones or turn them off. Today's event is also being live streamed. By those of us who are joining online, you can submit your questions online at csrc@asu.edu, and we'll address as many of these questions as we can later this evening. For those of you who are here on person, there were some cards at the table, which as you watch and participate in this panel, if there's a question that comes to your mind, please feel free to write that question down and then pass those questions to the end of the row where they'll be collected and possibly used for a question later this evening. And we'd ask that those questions be submitted by 6:25. Lastly, I think we're already to that point. Many of you enjoyed those hors d'oeuvres, and they're going to stop serving those at 5:45, just so we don't disrupt the discussion tonight. Well, with all of that, we again welcome all of you here today and turn the time over now to Professor Carlson.
Test. Can you hear me okay out there? All right, good. I love the thumbs up. Thank you, Brother Olson. A special thank you for your generosity and your hospitality, offering up this beautiful space for this event. This is a great building, and it has the benefit that if this event is not your kind of thing, there's a basketball court just on the other side of that curtain. So have at it, have a ball. If this is your first event, first time coming to an event sponsored by CSRC, welcome. I encourage you to learn more about our center. Go to our website, sign up for our mailing list, and learn about all of the events that we've got planned for the spring semester. This is our last fall event. And if you're a student, a special word of welcome, and I want to invite you to learn about all the programs and scholarships we offer through our center. Now, if you've been to other events in our center, you may notice several things that are different about tonight's, but one thing that is not going to be different is that I do often start with a little joke. So here goes. In light of tonight's event, an imam, an LDS bishop, and a college professor walk into a bar. Just kidding. That would never happen. Tonight's event is special for one reason is that there are so many different organizations that have partnered together to make it possible. I mentioned the Tempe Institute of Religion. We're looking forward to forming great collaborations with them. But I also want to recognize specifically our event planner, Alex Brooks. Where's Alex? There she is in the back. She has been instrumental bringing this event to fruition, been a great liaison with the and a consistent presence here at the Institute, and of course a faithful member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. From here on out, which I'm just going to shorten as LDS. In any case, thank you so much, Alex, for bringing all the different moving pieces of this event together. We're also thrilled to be partnering with the Center for the Muslim Experience in the United States, led by my colleagues Yasmin Saikia and Chad Haynes, who's here tonight. We've worked with them on lots of different events, but I have to say this is one of my favorites so far that we've had a chance to collaborate on. Now, bear with me, those are just the campus partners. Here comes the rest. This event is also co-sponsored and financially supported by an organization called the Bellah Legacy Group, which continues the work and the influence of the famous sociologist Robert Bellah. And I'll say more about him in a few minutes. You may have heard of a book called Habits of the Heart, published in 1985. That was one of the most famous ones. Several of Bellah's co-authors are part of this Bellah Legacy Group with me, and some of them may be watching this event and the live stream of it right now, in fact. We're very much interested in supporting this work, and I want to recognize particularly another member of that legacy group, Harlan Stelmach, who I know is watching, has been very excited about this event, and we want to thank him especially for his support. So thank you, Harlan. Finally, we're extremely honored to have with us tonight in person Robert Bellah's daughter, Jennifer Bellah McGuire, who is not only a great supporter of the Bellah Legacy Group, she has also done much to sustain and extend her father's influence. We are thrilled that you have flown in from California to be here for this event. Thank you so much, Jennifer. All right, so tonight's event has a few different goals. One goal is simply to provide an occasion for interreligious dialogue, community connection, ways to push back against some of the forces of division that are doing great harm in our civic life right now. We Americans need to practice learning how to live and talk with one another, and this event is one way to do that. Second, we want to consider the ways that two growing and very important religious communities, Muslims and members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, have moved steadily from the margins toward the American mainstream. In this sense, they resemble religious minorities in earlier eras, such as Catholics, Jews, and others, who faced discrimination, prejudice, some kind of view of othering. Now, why is that important? Well, because in the effort to seek equality, tolerance, acceptance, religious minorities often provide distinctly religious reasons for affirming the American experiment and the democratic values and principles that sustain that experiment. In 1956, a sociologist by the name of Will Herberg wrote a book entitled Protestant Catholic Jew, describing how these two minorities' religions were becoming essential contributors to what we might call American consensus or consensus about American values. But if that book were written today, Muslims and Latter-day Saints, among other traditions, would need to be in the title. Now, those of us who are not part of these communities, we especially need to understand those perspectives and how these religious appeals to higher principles and ideals underscore that the United States is not just for people who are in the religious, racial, or ethnic majority. And this brings me to a third goal of tonight's event, to think about how we Americans, regardless of our faith traditions, can shore up our collective faith in American democracy. Because right now, I would say that our faith in democracy is faltering. What I'm calling our democratic faith is but one way to articulate an idea that Robert Bellah first laid out in a 1967 article called Civil Religion in America. He understood it as the American experience of self-government in light of universal truths and through reference to a shared heritage of events, beliefs, stories, symbols, and ideals that point to some higher transcendent reality. That's a lot of words, and civil religion may be this kind of academic term that you hear, but the reality is it's in our history and it's everywhere around us. It's in the coins that we're carrying in our pocket that say, "In God we trust." It's in the self-evident truths and the God-given rights articulated in the Declaration. It's in the soaring rhetoric of Lincoln at Gettysburg or of Reagan at the D-Day commemoration in Normandy. It's in King's letter from a Birmingham jail. It's in the oaths and inaugurals of presidents. It's in the verse of a young poet named Amanda Gorman, who spoke of the hill we climb if only we dare it, because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. Some people heard those words in person, didn't they? I remember that. Civil religion was also in the air when, during the January 6th insurrection, our leader spoke of how our temple of democracy had been desecrated. Gorman also referenced this incident in her poem, invoking history's judgment the possibility of redemption, the need to affirm this truth, this faith, and this trust in democracy. The word democracy comes from the Greek word demos, meaning people. And Robert Bellah said something very prophetic in his article, and I'll close with this. He says, in a democracy, the will of the people is not itself the criterion of right and wrong. There is a higher criterion, a higher standard, in terms of which this will of the people can be judged. And it is possible that the people may be wrong. Civil religion doesn't replace our own individual faith traditions. It overlaps with it. In fact, our individual traditions reinforce why we still, civil religion reinforces why we still need our individual faith traditions to ensure democracy succeeds. They point to higher truths on which democracy depends. They give us moral criteria by which history will judge us. I hope our conversation tonight can help all of us further this endeavor. Thank you for indulging my efforts to explain some of this larger context behind this event. I hope that's helpful and not too confusing. If you're interested in learning more about tonight's events and issues, we have created for further reading cards that you can pick up in the back. I'd also like to now turn things over to my colleague, Professor Yasmin Saikia. She is the Hart Nikachos Chair in Peace Studies and the co-director of the Center for Muslim Experience in the U.S. She will introduce our guests and get our conversation started. Yasmin.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Peace to everybody. I am representing both the Center of the Study for Religion and Conflict and the Center of Muslim Experience, and I have the honor to introduce our two distinguished guests today. Our first, going from the left, is Ambassador Jeff Flake. Probably all of you know a lot about him, but I have something written up, so I have to also say that. Okay. Ambassador Flake has been until recently the ambassador in Turkey. Previously, he was in the Senate and also in the House of Representatives from 2001 to 2013, right? And 2013 to 19 in the Senate. His work in Turkey was so phenomenal that he brought Sweden to be part of NATO, and Sweden honored him with a special award called the Order of the Polar Star. Now, Ambassador Flake just doesn't do diplomacy, he also writes, like we academics sometimes do, but his is a bestseller book, unlike ours. And his bestseller book is called Conscience of a Conservative, A Rejection of Destructive Politics and a Return to Principle. So thank you so much for joining us today, Ambassador Flake. Our second distinguished guest is Salam Al-Marayati, who is the president and co-founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, which is nationally recognized for the work it's doing to make Islam part of the Western, particularly American world, so that there is better understanding, as my colleague, Professor John Carlson mentioned. Salam Marayati is also a native of Tempe, Arizona, although he has moved to California since. So he returns to us from California, but he is a son of the soil from here, from Tempe. And I would like to add that he has been very influential in sort of bringing questions and ideas concerning Islamic ideas, principles and values of justice, of human rights that Islam understands, to the conversation, even to the White House, the Capitol Hill, and to international conferences. He is well known in the larger circuit of the media and the TV world through CNN, Fox News, and C-SPAN. And most importantly for us, he also writes, and he writes in well-known outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. So welcome, and we look forward to having this conversation with our two distinguished guests today. So I will start with the first question to Ambassador Flake. Ambassador Flake, as a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, how do you feel being in America and being an American? Does it help you be more, feel more comfortable in America, being a member of LDS? And along with it, I want to tag another question. The question being, it was not always easy. I know that since when I came here nearly 40 years ago to the US to study, I had friends who were members of the LDS and they felt very marginalized. But today, it's a little different. So what were those challenges and experiences and episodes that you, as a member of a faith community that was marginal and had to integrate, navigate in this world, have experienced, and what can we learn from you, people like us who are Muslims, who are still trying to figure out how to be in America and be American Muslims?
Well, thank you, and thank you to the organizers and sponsors for this evening. This is wonderful. I'm grateful to be here with my wife Cheryl and our son Austin are here, and just really enjoy this. I had the good fortune of growing up in a community, Snowflake, Arizona, that largely members of the LDS Church and a lot of family. I have 10 brothers and sisters and 69 first cousins. That's how I got elected. So it's a pretty good start. I used to campaign around the state with John McCain, and John McCain would complain endlessly, I have to fight for every vote I get, and you just have to call a family council. That's all. So, but also being a member of the church, I had the good fortune of following many of those into politics who set a good example of what a member of the church should be. By the time I got to the House of Representatives, there were 13 of us. When I got to the Senate, 7 of the senators, 7 out of 100, were members of the church. And so it didn't seem like a marginalized group. It was a bigger group. And like I said, those who came before me set a good example. And so I've been fortunate in that way, and I know it hasn't always been that way. The church hasn't always been accepted in this country. I should mention that back to Snowflake, in the late 1800s, the church was concerned that maybe too many members of the church would belong to one party or the other, and a different administration would come in and maybe favor the other party and disfavor the church. And so in some congregations, the leaders of the church would say, those sitting in the left pews, register Democrat. Those sitting in the right pews, register Republican. In Snowflake, the demarcation was Main Street. And sometime in the 1880s, they said, those living east of Main Street, register Democrat. West of Main Street, Republican. And the Flakes were east of Main Street. And so we were Democrats for almost 5 generations until my generation. So that the church has been concerned about marginalization, but I've been, like I said, fortunate to follow good examples and people who had set good examples for the church. And I'm sure we can talk as we go along about some of the interaction with the Muslim faith as well.
But I want to follow up there. You said you had good example and you had good leaders. So is it because they had already set the tone, they had through the exemplary behavior, or was it something about America that made them, better LDS Christians?
Well, certainly, with the church being restored here on this continent, it's easier. And I've lived in Southern Africa for about 3 years, obviously in Turkey for 3 years. We've been in places where it's not as hospitable or not as known, but it's becoming so. My wife and I will go to Zimbabwe in January for the dedication of a temple. When I was in that country, there were about 100 members. Now there are 7,000. Wow. And so just in Zimbabwe alone, so it's changing. But it's a little less comfortable when you're one of a few. And in Turkey, obviously, we were hugely in the minority. But I still maintain that by the time I went wherever, there were people who preceded me setting good examples, and that I really appreciate.
Thank you. Mr. Al-Marayati, we're grateful to have you and welcome from Los Angeles back home. A similar question that we asked Ambassador Flake, how has being an American or living in America helped facilitate you being able to practice your faith?
Well, I believe that the only country that really gives us the freedom to practice our faith for ourselves, by ourselves, is America. If I live, unfortunately, in a Muslim majority country, such as Saudi Arabia or Iran or any country there, usually the ideology of the government is what you have to follow. And if you don't follow that, then you're considered a threat. And even the Quran has to be approved by the government there. There is no such thing here in America, not yet at least. And we want to make sure it doesn't happen that way. So being an American Muslim, to me, it is where Islam's home is America. It's a natural home. Because Islam stands for freedom. When we say there is no God but the one God, means I will not submit to any general, any leader, any dictator, anyone. I only submit to God Almighty. So that La ilaha illallah, there's no God but the one God, is our cry for freedom. And we find our freedom here in America. And likewise, being a good Muslim makes me a better citizen here in America. Because Islam says the only purpose of religion is to establish equity and is to benefit people. If it does not establish equity and benefit people, then it's not true religion. It's just a bunch of chanting and it's a bunch of rituals that really don't add up to anything. And so unless you serve humanity, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, his title was a mercy to all of humanity. And if we don't follow that example, then we are not being true Muslims. And therefore, it makes us more civically responsible. And having that idea that, aside from all the politics, that people use faith for division, we believe that faith is what brings humanity together if we follow the principles of our respective faiths.
Can I ask just a follow-up on this topic? In your own ways, each of you have expressed the importance of religious freedom as a kind of central principle of American political life. But I know that each of you have some thoughts on the Constitution, and I'd like to hear you speak a little bit about that and some other principles in American life. Salam, we were in class together with my students earlier, and you were talking about the similarities and the important parallels between the Medina Constitution established in 622 and the U.S. Constitution established, sometime later, 1789, right? So maybe you could comment on that. And then a question for Ambassador Blake. It's a tenet of the LDS faith, as I understand it, that the U.S. Constitution is divinely inspired. And I'd like to hear you say more about that, why that's important. Because I think most people would sort of think of, we talk about our, God-given rights, or being certain rights endowed by our Creator in the Declaration, but the Constitution, what's at stake in that kind of a claim? So,
You want me to go first?
why don't you go first?
Yeah.
Salam? Yeah.
So, in Islamic history, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, established a state in a place called Medina. It was called Yathrib at the time. And he was not brought into Medina as a prophet, necessarily. He was brought to the tribes of Medina to bring peace between the warring tribes. That's why he was selected. And he sent somebody there to teach people about religion, mainly about monotheism against polytheism, but it wasn't imposed on the population. And from that, when he entered Medina as the ruler, it was the first time in history where the ruler established a social contract. Because previous to that, of course, you either became the leader because of a bloodline or you killed the family that was ruling, and then you became the leader that way. And of course, he came in peacefully for peace, security, and therefore developed the Medina Constitution. And the Medina Constitution, there are basically three concepts within the Constitution, if you study it carefully. The first is open citizenship. In other words, anybody that wants to become a citizen of Medina became a citizen of Medina. You came in, you say, I pledge allegiance to this Constitution, and therefore I become a citizen of the state. I believe that's exactly what the U.S. Constitution is all about. In fact, what makes America great is that you don't have to be of a certain race or a certain religion to be an American. What makes you an American is the United States Constitution. And if we all pledge allegiance to that, then we're all Americans. And the same thing for the Medina Constitution. The second concept that we find in the Constitution is one of pluralism. In other words, the Prophet was a Muslim, of course, and Muslims were only 15% of the population at that time, and there were Jewish tribes and there were polytheistic tribes. So each of those tribes came in, they became stakeholders of the state, for the state. And he even said, he wrote down, the Jews are a community alongside the Muslims. They have their religion and we have ours. In other words, they can follow their Jewish law and Jewish customs because, first of all, we believe it's a divine revelation, but more importantly, they have the autonomy as human beings to follow their law and their customs. So there was coexistence and pluralism within that state. And then the third concept was one of a common defense or security. In other words, if you became part of the state, then the state's responsibility is to make you safe and secure. And I believe these are three themes that are really important for modern governance, and I believe the Medina Constitution has very strikingly similar strands than as it has in the U.S. Constitution. And not to say that Islam is really close to the West or is a Western faith and not an Eastern faith or things like that. It's a universal faith first and foremost. But I believe that it is what made the prophet a great prophet, like all the prophets, is that they were part of a human struggle for freedom and for human dignity. And that was definitely manifested in the Medina Constitution.
Yes, as Latter-day Saints, we believe that the Constitution was divinely inspired. The church had not been restored to the earth by the time the Constitution was written, and we believe that it had to be in a free country with free exercise of religion in order for that restoration to be accomplished. And it was. But that said, we do not believe that this country was established only to protect this religion. It was to be a country where freedom of religion is expressed and espoused and protected, and it is in the First Amendment to the Constitution. And then also, if you look at our Articles of Faith, one of our Articles of Faith is saying that we believe that anyone should be able to worship how, where, or what they may, and to not force that. And so that's a tenet of our faith, is religious freedom. That's why it was so when I was in the Senate in 2015 during the presidential campaign, and when one of the candidates said that we should have a Muslim ban to ban all Muslims from coming to the United States, I thought that was the complete antithesis of everything we believe in. And so that weekend, my wife Cheryl and I and our youngest two sons went to the mosque in Scottsdale during Friday prayers. And I gave a speech at that time titled Mormons and Muslims, and talked about the similarities between our religions and how it was important that we protect freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Our two young sons, who are used to setting up chairs before church meetings, were just appreciative there were no chairs to set up in the mosque. That's what they appreciated more than anything. But I think that we do believe this is a divinely inspired constitution to protect freedom of religion and free agency of anybody to worship how, where, or what they may.
Thank you.
Thank you both. This is a question for both of you. Maybe we'll start with Ambassador Flake this time, and then Mr. Al-Marayati. How might being a faithful Latter-day Saint or Muslim make one a good American? Each of these great faiths have moral codes and health codes, and just as you mentioned earlier, Mr. Al-Marayati, the idea to go out and serve and bless our neighbors. So how might living your own faith help contribute to the fabric and goodness of America.
I think you just said it. Yeah, I mean, any government cannot function unless there's some kind of moral character or something that pushes people toward the greater good, to think of a cause greater than themselves. And that's what religion does, to serve your neighbor as you wish to be served, and to take care of those in need. And no government can function long if there's only self-interest rules. So I think that I know the founders were concerned, many of the founders, that, that if religion were not present, or some higher power and belief in a higher entity, that the country wouldn't last long. And I think that we have to be not just great, but good as a people and religious. And for me, if I am living my religion, I'm a better person for doing it, and a better citizen of my country.
Yeah, I agree 100% that really what we're talking about, that our religions are promoting civic responsibility. It's not just about us. It's about service to the needy, service to those who care for our country. And service is a fundamental aspect of our respective faiths. When you talk about the First Amendment, it says the freedom of speech, which means it's something that God has given us, not government, God. And a good government is what preserves the freedom of speech. And a bad government, obviously, is what violates it. So we have to make that very clear. And as Thomas Jefferson said, the God that gave us human life is the one who gave us liberty. So it all comes from God. And therefore, that liberty, that freedom, has to be defended for every human being. And the Quran says two things that are very important as it relates to this discussion. The first, in chapter 2, 256, it says, there is no compulsion in matters of faith. And it even told the prophet, you cannot compel people to believe. Your job is just to deliver the message and then and create freedom, and then let their conscience decide which direction they want to go to, and it's between them and God. That's what's sacred. That sacred relationship between every human being and God. And that's what we have to preserve. Not telling them how to worship or what faith to follow. The second important verse in the Quran, as it relates to our discussion here, is it says, God has bestowed dignity on the children of Adam. So this idea of human dignity, whether a person believes or doesn't believe, has to be defended by every person of faith, and that is something that is important for our country, the United States of America, because we have to stand for human dignity, we stand for human rights, we stand for democracy, which means that people have the right to participate and the responsibility to participate, and they are all stakeholders in this American project. Without it, then all these wonderful words, these eloquent speeches that Professor Carlson told us in his initial remarks, they are just empty words that are now archived in museums and monuments. They have to be lived in everyday governance. And faith communities are the ones that are prepared to take those words and manifest them in everyday life.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on this question? Because I think one of the things that's interesting about both LDS and Muslims is that these are two faith traditions particularly known for their piety, for some rigorous practices that many other traditions, and especially in the United States, don't practice. Obviously, abstaining from alcohol and other prohibited items. Muslims go on Hajj if they're able to. Young LDS men and women go on mission up to 2 years. Muslims pray 5 times a day, and an LDS worship service is 2 hours long. Oh my gosh. Which, if you're from my background, when my dad was preaching, if he went 2 minutes over, he'd hear about it at the end of the service, let me tell you. But I wonder if just the practices of living your faith adds something to our understanding that we've talked a lot about the principles and the beliefs, the theological commitments, etc. But even just the practices of living, of practicing self-restraint, of discipline, maybe others could learn from that. I'm not sure that other traditions, many other traditions, follow that quite as rigorously as yours.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, there are 5 pillars in Islam. The first is to testify. Testify that there's only one God, but there's no God but the one God, God Almighty, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. So the idea of testifying is a ritual. And it's not just testifying to that truth, but to testify every truth. And God will hold us accountable on that day of judgment as witnesses, shuhada. And shahada is the first pillar. So it's the same theme, that we are witnesses to the truth before God, even if we have to testify against ourselves. That's what the Quran says. The second pillar is the prayer, 5 times a day, that we have to make that connection to God, to remind ourselves that God's presence is what will save us, what will take us to salvation. And forgetting God will create corruption. The third pillar is the hardest one for us, or at least for me, and that's the fasting. And you have to fast daylight hours for 30 days. And I used to do that in Arizona in the summer, which is quite a feat. While everybody was in the pool and having barbecues, I was fasting. And so, but that fasting, what I later learned about myself and the faith was telling us is that your spiritual part of being is more important than your carnal part of being. If we don't have a spiritual dimension and you don't feed that spirituality, then all you are just like animals who just go and consume, and that's it. And so the fasting makes you a real human being, and it's about true freedom when you free yourself from your impulses and desires. And then charity, zakat, is what's called the self-purification dues. You're purifying yourself by giving. And it is more than just giving money, but it's that attitude of giving. And then the fifth pillar, the final one, is the Hajj, where you see that it is all of humanity that is going around the temple, and it is that one God that all of humanity circumambulates. And reminding yourself that you're part of the human family. As the Quran says, O humanity, you have been created from a single pair, a male and a female, and made into different nations and tribes so that you might come to learn and know one another. And the best among you are the ones who are conscious of God.
Well, we were so fortunate to be able to go to Turkey, 97% Muslim. It's my wife, Cheryl, when we were at BYU dating, before we got married, was part of the BYU singing, dancing touring group called the Young Ambassadors. And just before we got married, she took a tour to the Middle East and Southern Europe and ended up in Turkey. And she came back and said, my favorite place. And for 30 years wanted to go back. And so when I was given this opportunity, she said, I've been the young ambassador to Turkey. You can be the old one now. So, but when we were called, just the day before we flew for that assignment, we met with the Council of the 12, in what's called the Area Committee. And it's the members of the 12, and they had just finished and gave us the first copy, which we have here, of Muslims and Latter-day Saints. And if I would encourage you, for those who are a member of the LDS Church, you can get it on LDS Tools and the directory and just find it, and it will talk about what you mentioned, the similarities, the things like fasting. Boy, Ramadan is an incredible commitment. We do it for a couple of meals every month, but boy, when Ramadan comes and they're fasting day after day, we got tired of going to so many iftars, the break the fast thing for a month long. I couldn't imagine doing that every day, but it's real commitment. And the commitment, we were so impressed with the commitment to family and those pillars, sacred places, similarities to us, laws on health and chastity. So many similarities, and it was just a wonderful experience in that way to be there. There is nothing more beautiful than to hear the call to prayer 5 times a day, unless you're living right by a mosque and it's coming out of the speaker. For those, they may be a little too close, but for us, where we could faintly hear it at 5 a.m. At our residence, but then again, and just knowing of that commitment, and it made me want to be a better member of my own religion and to pray more fervently. And so I just had the greatest admiration. When it was first rumored or noticed that I might be going to Turkey, there were a couple of tweets that came around in Turkey that I've saved just because they were so funny. One of them said, Mormon cowboy said, "This is not Utah, and you're not Brigham Young." Persona non grata. But I didn't know how we would be received. But fortunately, I mentioned in 2015, I gave that speech titled "Mormons and Muslims." That had aired on NBC, and it made its way over and made the rounds in Turkey, and that helped soften the ground, I guess, when I got there. And I didn't know if the last ambassador was almost declared persona non grata. I just thought, as long as I can stay in the country, I'll be all right. But that was a great help, and we had a great experience there because they knew we respected their religion, and they respected ours. And so it was, but I just have the utmost respect for religions that require much of their adherence. And in the Muslim faith, much is required. And that's why it's not just for us, a Sunday religion or a once-a-week religion. It's something that we try to live every day.
These are really wonderful comments, and I think ways you are helping us understand the value of what religion is in the lives of people who practice it. I want to bring that religion is not something, as you said, not just on Sunday or not just on a day of the month or something. It's an everyday thing. How are those religious values, the practices, how do they help this democracy? How can we use those values, those principles, in actually creating, strengthening and also learning and also talking about the limits of American democracy, and particularly tolerance, which is really becoming quite a major issue these days, right? The lack of tolerance. So how do we work on these issues?
Well, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we're instructed to be involved in the civic process, to be involved in elections. We're never told how to vote, but we're told to be involved and to be informed. And also one of the articles of faith that I mentioned before, being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. And so we are counseled and believe in supporting our government. And so I think that in itself, if we follow our religion, we are good citizens. We try to be. But just being following the moral laws and being a moral person. If you are, then you don't run into the difficulties of those who the law has to be applied, a coercion somehow. If we're doing that on our own volition, then there's less for government to do. So I think that helps if you're living your religion.
Well, Islam demands that from the believer, that he or she has to be engaged. It's actually a command. Says, invite people to the way of your Lord with wisdom and beautiful admonition. And so that idea of inviting people is a responsibility. And that, as the ambassador said, is part of our civic responsibility that is integral to our faiths. And the way of your Lord, it didn't say go and convert them to Islam. It says the way of your Lord is the way of justice, compassion, mercy, human dignity, freedom, and all these really develop that way of your Lord, the way of your Lord. That's what we're inviting people to, and to do it in a nice way, not screaming at people, not berating people, but to do it in a way that's beautiful. And the best way to do it is by our own example, first and foremost. And the Quran also says the closest thing to piety is justice. It says, be just, that is closest to piety. So these are intertwined. They're not inseparable. They're not separable. They're inseparable. In fact, I believe that the Quran and religion is telling us that the will of the people is inseparable from the will of God. That people have the right to make mistakes. And you have to go for their consultation and gain their consent on anything that you want to apply to everybody. For your faith, you do it as you deem fit. You want to fast 30 days, you fast. You want to fast two extra days every week, which some people do, which I really salute them for that, because for me, Ramadan is enough. But people fast other days after Ramadan. You want to make extra prayers, you can do that. You can give the longest speeches as long as it's to yourself and not to a crowd. But the idea of imposing on other people is an anathema to faith, I believe. And I think that's the beauty of religion. I believe that is why the LDS, and I admire a lot of the work of the Latter-day Saints. First and foremost, the idea of family as a social unit, and how family is fundamental to the success of the church, and that is something obviously that's shared very much with Islam, and the idea of giving, and the idea of really it's egalitarian faith in that we don't have professional religious people running our religious communities. Many of the mosques have been run by doctors and engineers and the working class. Yes, you bring a scholar who's learned in the language and maybe in the history and maybe even in some legality, but at the end of the day, every person has to make his or her own choice and decisions. So these are all part of how we contribute to society. Lastly, we contribute to society by defending anybody who is scapegoated. Any kind of racism or bigotry that is targeting any community, especially those who are outside our faith community, is a responsibility of ours to defend. And I believe that is one of the most important ways that we can restore confidence in the American tradition. The American tradition has been that government never represented a religion. Even though they happened to be all Christian, they never imposed that on the society. It was a secular society, and even though America is the most secular society, it was always known as the most religious society. But in Europe and the Middle East, when states adopted a religion, the society became less religious, because opposing the state meant you opposed that religion. And if you didn't like the state, then you disliked the religion. And unfortunately, that's what's happening in a lot of Muslim majority countries today. So America, in that tradition of separating religion and making that the property of the people, religion is property of the people, not the property of the state. I believe that's something that we can promote and defend and manifest and restore people's confidence in our democracy.
Thank you. I've been inspired by these. As I mentioned at the beginning, what do I hope to get from this? It's understanding and relationships, and I've learned so much by hearing all of your comments. Thank you. With that,
I just want to thank the ambassador. I call you senator because that's how I knew you as a senator, especially when you came to the mosque and spoke, for defending our community. I think after 9/11, the Church of Latter-day Saints, so many other communities, Japanese Americans, Jewish Americans, came to the defense of Muslims to say, let's not go down that path again of internment. And I believe we preserved America as a free society because of the work of people like Ambassador Flake. So thank you very much.
Well, I've always been inspired that, like, for example, the incident that caused the politician to say there should be a Muslim ban, I think it was in San Bernardino. There was some political violence that happened, and at that time, the Muslim community there raised money for the victims of another faith. And that always just impressed me, that, and that is true religion. We saw it happen with when the LDS Church in Michigan a while ago was started on fire, and somebody ran their truck into it and bombed it. The family of the one who committed the crime had nothing to do with it, but members of the church and that community raised money for that woman and her child. And it reminded me of that incident in San Bernardino, where in one case the Muslim faith did it, in the other case the Mormon faith did it. And that is true religion, as we're taught in the New Testament and in the Book of Mormon.
Thank you. Before we came in here, Mr. Al-Marayati and I had a chance just to visit and exchange some information about our families. And as we got talking, we started to talk about families and the importance of families in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we believe they're a fundamental unit of society. And I learned similar feelings from the Muslim faith. And so I'd love to hear from both of you about the importance of the family from your faith perspectives and how that impacts the nation at large.
Well, you know, as I said earlier, I believe what happens to the family is what happens to the country. And if we don't preserve that family unit, we lose not only the social fabric, but the actual moral underpinnings of our society. And I believe families that pray, that fast, that contribute, that are charitable, that represent kindness, is what makes America great. And they do that voluntarily. They do that out of their own conscience. Nobody's telling them to do that. And I believe the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Islamic faith, are like this when it comes to the issue of family. And I was very honored to be one of the people outside the faith to attend the opening of the Ogden Temple. And we saw how the idea of marriage was part of the church's structure and the church's activities. And I admired that as a Muslim father who wants to see my children married and have children who will marry within the faith and have faith. And so I believe that is how we are contributing to the moral fabric of our country.
Yes, and our faith, that is how our values and our beliefs are passed down. It's in family structure. And obviously some things are learned in meetings in church, but it's really in the family that goes on. And I admired while we were in Turkey the commitment to family there. Everyone in Turkey, when you ask them where they're from, they all will harken back to their hometown. No matter how long they've been gone from it or whatever, they know it, and that's family. And they revere their mothers and their fathers and grandparents and take care of them, and that is really something I've admired about the Muslim faith.
What's that? Yeah. I have one question that I want to ask to finish out our moderator questions, and then we'll turn to the audience. And I'll just make this very brief. We saw yesterday a very important statement issued by the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops that took a very, very strong critical stance towards the current U.S. policy on immigration, both in terms of the overall concerns of immigration, the overall goals and focus on deportation and detention, et cetera, but also on the treatment, the inhumane treatment that they noticed and its effect on those held in detention and their ability to practice their faith, to have access to religious liberty, et cetera. I'd like to hear each of you comment on where Islam, where the LDS Church stands on questions of immigration, as many of us think about this, the massive focus on deportation in this country right now.
Well, it's an issue that I worked on quite a bit, part of the Gang of Eight, and trying to get a resolution to this years and years ago. Obviously, countries have to have borders. You have to enforce your laws, but you also need to be humane and recognize that people are human beings. And I've winced as I've seen some of the actions that have taken place and the way we've gone about that unnecessarily. And I hope that we can change that. We have always been the shining city on the hill, and I hate to think that people would see us as anything but that. I believe in Ronald Reagan's old statement that what America represents, and that if there have to be walls, there have to be doors that swing wide open to people who have come, the tired, the poor,
Huddled masses.
the huddled masses. And so that's always what we've been, and I hope that we can continue to be while still ensuring that our security is there. And I think we can do that. I hope we can find a way.
Of course, as American Muslims, we've experienced similar harms right after 9/11, where our civil liberties were taken away for a false sense of security. And as Benjamin Franklin said, those who want to sacrifice their civil liberties for temporal safety deserve neither. And I believe we're going down that track again. I agree, we need to have strong borders and border protection, and we definitely need to have a better process of how migrant workers are brought into our country. They do the work that nobody wants to do. We benefit from them economically, at the very least. They create jobs. They create commerce. And then when we decide that we don't want them, we unleash the national security apparatus against them. And like I said, we know how it feels to have the national security apparatus unleashed against our community. Our students had to suffer that for the last 2 years because they wanted to speak out against the genocide in Gaza. And so I see that as a trend now, as a common trend, and that is happening to certain communities, that is taking us away from what America really represents. And that we can solve these problems, as the ambassador said, in a more humane way, and in a more effective way for that matter. Because at the end of the day, the demographics of the United States is not going to change that much. We are a country of immigrants. And it may have been Italians and Irish and Catholics and Jews in the early 20th century. Now it's Muslims and people from Latin America and people from Afghanistan and people from so many parts of the world that are coming here because they believe that America is giving them that chance for freedom, that opportunity, and that the Statue of Liberty is inviting them to America. And then also, if we really want to solve a lot of these problems, then I think we have to think of it beyond our borders. In other words, what can we do as Americans, as the United States of America, to make other countries more economically stable and prosperous, and reduce propensity for going to war in these countries, especially in the Middle East, that creates the refugee crisis to begin with. And then they go to Europe, and then Europeans are complaining about immigrants replacing them. So it's much more complex than let's just kick people out of the country and then we act as if that's the path towards freedom and security. It's not. It's much more complicated than that.
Let me just say one thing. You mentioned a book that I wrote. One of the chapters was on immigration. And I mentioned in there that my father-in-law The start of the chapter said his heart stopped. He was playing softball and just, all of a sudden almost killed over with a heart attack. He was saved by two skilled doctors, one a Palestinian and the other from Afghanistan. First generation people here, that he would not be here were it not for their skills and expertise. And we are a nation of immigrants. We obviously have to have laws and a way to go about it, but boy, we've got to find a way to still be a generous country. I think I heard the figures today. This year, we will likely admit only 7,000 refugees into the country. Traditionally, it's been about 250,000, and there may be somewhere in there that is the right number, but it's probably not 7,000. I think we can be more generous than that.
Thank you very much. Okay, I want to get to some questions here from the audience here. A couple questions on misinformation and the attack upon truth. How do you strive to teach truth to others, especially to your family, children, grandchildren, when it's explicitly under attack? Other questions having to do about information and misinformation, disinformation, especially about Islam, including many politicians speaking as such. How can we respond?
Yeah, you had a senator, Tommy Tupperville, former coach for Auburn Tigers. He had a presentation to the Senate, where you go and speak to the Senate floor, and it says, "Ban Sharia." And he made it sound like Muslims are here to supplant the U.S. Constitution with our own laws. First of all, Tommy Tupperville, when asked about the three branches of the U.S. government, he said, yes, we have the House, the Senate, and the executive. So he needs to learn more about American civics before he can start talking about what we can or cannot do as it relates to the U.S. Constitution. Second of all, Sharia simply means the road to God. And the road to God is through the way of God, which is justice, mercy, compassion. That's Sharia. What you see in certain Muslim-majority countries, which is disgusting, is a practice of those countries. That's why many of us fled those countries and came here to America. And we speak out against child marriage or sexual violence or harassment against religious minorities in those countries because we feel that's what Islam stands for. And are you going to listen to us, or are you going to just go over there and say that that's what Islam is? And if you really are against what's happening over there, okay, stop taking trillions of dollars from those countries that are enabling that mentality. That's the hypocrisy of it all. We're the ones, we the people, are the ones speaking for the truth. And we need the lens to move away from the frame of extremism to the frame of what the Muslim peoples are really all about. And that has to be done through forums like this, through coalition building. I have to get a TikTok account, I don't know, but God forbid. But yes, we need to do a better job of getting that information out. But I believe the best way, honestly, is through these kinds of forums, people to people, and then going to churches, going to synagogues, and having mosques. And now there's an open mosque day where people come in and ask questions like that. That's the way we overcome fear with the truth.
I may have been the first senator to quote a Mormon hymn, or LDS hymn, "Oh, say what is truth," on the Senate floor when I was disturbed about some of the misinformation and the lack of truthful comments that had been made. So yeah, truth, objective truth is what this is all about, and we've got to get back to it. I'm not sure it'll be through TikTok or social media in general, but we could all use more truth, yes.
Some of you may know of our Recovering Truth Project, and Ambassador Flake was one of the very first people we spoke with. And I'm sorry to say that we're still in this state where we're all trying to recover truth this many years later, even after that very inspiring speech on the Senate well. Here's a question from Muj Jones, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name properly, is for Ambassador Flake. Tocqueville came to America to study democracy. You went to Turkey and saw a different model up close in a Muslim society with a secular state. What did you learn there that Americans should understand when they think about Islam, secularism, and democratic institutions?
That's a great question. Turkey is a bit of an anomaly there. Obviously, Ataturk, 100 years ago, decided this is going to be a secular state. And a secular state was enforced pretty strongly, which allowed some freedom of religion, but prohibited some as well. Women could not express their religion by covering women in a university setting or a business or government setting. And so only recently that law has changed. And so Turkey is still trying to figure out how to straddle that in the right way, to still have a secular state but allow religion. Some people were concerned that if a hijab is allowed one day, it will be required the next. And you still have those questions. They're trying to do the best they can in that regard. We have had some concerns, the United States has, about democratic backsliding there in that country. Having said that, Turks value their voting franchise very strongly. And they if you look at election days, the last elections, the opposition parties won big all across the country in municipalities everywhere. But it was great to see a country like that almost in the Middle East, straddling the Middle East, a secular country, 97% Muslim, struggle with those issues and doing it for the most part fairly well, and still allowing most freedom of religion. Although we've been concerned that there are some concerns still, but still they're doing the best they can.
I just want to say, I think religion's best friend is secularism, because secularism is supposed to be neutral on religion. But when secularism becomes anti-religion, then it's not really secularism. So we should demand from secularists that they stand true to what the definition of secularism is. And when they start banning the headscarf, that obviously is a violation of religious freedom. So, and vice versa, that if a religious leader, somebody who runs a state and he's religious, and says that you impose the headscarf, that is also against religious freedom and is against Islam. So we have to stop. What really bugs me about this issue is that we have to stop using the headscarf as a political football that endangers women throughout the Muslim world, and people throwing acid at women if they don't wear the headscarf the way they want them to wear, and religious police. That to me is the source of the problem, when men start dictating on women what they can and cannot wear.
I think we may need to make this one the last question, but this is for Salam. The American founding stressed loyalty to a republic of laws, while Islam speaks of a global ummah that transcends borders. From a Madisonian perspective, how compatible are these two sources of identity when tensions arise between, say, a global religious solidarity and national sovereignty?
I mean, I disagree with the premise of the question, obviously. You say a global ummah, yes, I'm connected to Muslims worldwide, just like the ambassador is going to Zimbabwe and feels a connection with the LDS community there. But he's not going to be a citizen of Zimbabwe now. Islam doesn't require me to be under the sovereignty of anything outside my country. In fact, Islam says, follow the law, be lawful in the country within which you live. And when you make a promise to anything, it's a promise to God. So don't break that promise. So when I make that pledge of allegiance to the United States of America, liberty and justice for all, I am making a promise to God. And therefore, that is my sacred oath. Nobody's going to tell me that I have to follow some global this or that. There's no, and that's another thing. There's no such construct of a global state or a global construct. We're just talking about hearts that are connected from a faith, and yes, there's closeness, but that it's very different from any kind of political sovereignty.
I said that was the last question, but I wanted to give you each an opportunity to maybe send us out tonight with one thing that we can do or think about differently as we go about our lives, either something inspired by your own faith traditions or your own backgrounds, experiences, to try to confront the intense polarization, the kind of broken relationships that are happening in many parts of our lives and our country. What can we do?
During my growing up, my mother placed on our refrigerator, I'm not sure if it was from a Relief Society lesson or what, but a phrase, assume the best, look for the good. And it was just on a 3x5 card, and it stayed on our refrigerator for years. It was stained with brownie and cookie mix and soy sauce, and you could barely read it, but it stayed there. And that really became a motto in our family, and I think it's the best motto to live by. I think if we all assume the best and look for the good, then we appreciate each other, and we won't try to force our beliefs on somebody else. We'll understand them more and assume that they're trying to do the best for them and their family as we are for ours. And so that's what I would urge.
I agree. To understand those, especially with those people with whom we disagree. And it takes me to a very important verse of the Quran, and it says, "Good and evil are not equal. Repel evil with that which is good, so that the one with whom there is enmity becomes as if he is your closest and warmest friend." So the Quran, and I believe there's something similar in the Bible, and to believe in that word of God that will ultimately prevail, like a good tree against a dead tree, a good word against a corrupt word. So that social conversion, not necessarily religious conversion, but social conversion from people who may misunderstand each other and may even have suspicion between each other and enmity. Change that first and foremost in your own heart and work towards that conversion from enmity to friendship.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your wisdom. I saw only 2 people get up to go play basketball, I think, so I'm going to say that this was a successful undertaking, and please join me in thanking our distinguished guests and co-moderators.